The snow had buried the tent again. Allison's blackened limbs were frozen to the floor, unmoving, stiff as iron. Someone inside was crying, or maybe praying. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. Outside, the wind screamed like a dying animal, scraping across the canvas walls and rattling what little was left of their shelter. There was no heat, no light, just the smell of frostbite, unwashed bodies, and death. A scene all too familiar in the Arctic. It was June 1884. The men of the Greely Expedition were no longer scientists, soldiers, or explorers. Whatever titles these men held were stripped away by hunger, cold, and time. They had eaten the last of their hardtack weeks ago. They had boiled their boots, scraping the gelatinous leather for any trace of nourishment. When that failed, they turned to their emergency rations. One man had been caught stealing food, an act of betrayal that couldn't be ignored, even in this frozen hell. Greely, the commander, had given the order himself. The man was executed by gunshot. This was just discipline, they told themselves. Survival. And still, at this time, there was no hope of rescue, or so it seemed. Who were these men? How had they ended up here, in the farthest corner of the earth, starving, dying, waiting for a ship that may never arrive? And the most pressing question of all, would anyone survive long enough to tell their story? And that's the question we're going to try and answer today. This is a harrowing episode. I think you're going to enjoy it, so stick around. This story didn't begin in June of 1884. It actually began 3 years earlier, when the mission was still filled with hope and promise. This wasn't a shipwreck. This wasn't a desperate gamble or an unsanctioned adventure. It was a carefully organized mission, approved by Congress and backed by the U.S. Signal Corps, and outfitted with literally the best supplies the government could muster. Originally, this mission was dubbed the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition, but in more modern times, the name the Greely Expedition has been widely adopted. There was 25 men, and they were led by Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, all being sent north as part of an international scientific effort. Their task was to establish a research outpost at the top of the world and collect data on Arctic tides, magnetism, weather, and ice. It was part of the first International Polar Year, a global partnership meant to expand human knowledge. The crew was a mix of Army men and specialists. There were trained meteorologists, experienced engineers, and mostly a mix of men chosen for their skills in their relative discipline rather than those with knowledge of Arctic survival. There was a photographer even for the mission, George Rice, and the rest of the crew basically included laborers, clerks, and soldiers, some eager and some reckless, but all bound together by duty. The expedition brought 2 years' worth of rations. Their ship, the Proteus, which delivered them safely to Lady Franklin Bay in 1881. There, they built Fort Conger, a long, insulated wooden shelter tucked against the frozen cliffs of northern Ellesmere Island. Unbelievably, not only were they able to bring enough lumber to build the longhouse, also several small buildings for storing equipment and housing additional people. The men adapted very quickly. They established daily routines, ran their scientific instruments, recorded tidal changes and barometric pressure. It was even said that the men took time in leisure activities such as playing cards or sitting around and telling stories. At first, the Arctic seemed harsh but manageable, hostile but beatable. But the one thing we know is the Arctic doesn't rage, it doesn't lash out. It just keeps going, day after day, until even the strongest men would begin to slip. The men that originally launched in August of 1881 had made it through their first winter, and by the summer of 1882, the men were in high spirits. The Arctic sun had returned, and though supplies were thinning, they were confident relief would arrive. That was the plan. Before leaving Washington, Greely had been assured that each summer, a resupply ship would be sent north, first to restock their provisions, and later to bring them home. The expedition was set to last until the summer of 1883, when the crew would actually return home, having set up the outpost. As part of their plan, they acknowledged that ice could likely block their rescue ships or relief ships, but they had a backup plan. Another ship would try the following year if it didn't work out, using some alternative routes if needed. Congress had authorized the funding for this mission, so they had access to essentially Navy ships at the time. This made them feel totally secure in their plan. So in their first summer, they sat there waiting. They would take turns watching in shifts, scanning the open sea for sails or smoke on the horizon. But as summer began to pass, no ship appeared on the horizon. It appeared that the ocean around them and the paths that the ships had to take were just blocked by ice in every direction. It finally dawned on the men that they would have to make it through another winter. But this wasn't the worst case scenario for them, at least at this point, because they had tons of supplies and they were all in high spirits. So they basically just waited out the winter, hanging out in the longhouse, passing the time. But then came 1883. Once again, the long dark winter leaves and sunlight finally returns. They anxiously looked to the water, scanning for sails and smoke. But no matter what direction they looked, the ice held fast. Not only was there no relief vessel in sight, there was no way for a relief vessel to actually get to them. Now, as I mentioned in other episodes, Arctic summer ice is a reality where some years it melts, some years it doesn't, so it's kind of like a gamble whether or not a ship would be able to take the same passage year after year. And here they are, for the second year in a row, stranded. The sea had cut them off from the world. Sergeant David Brainerd would record in his journal,
"It is beginning to be feared that the relief ship will not arrive, as the days grow shorter and the ice shows no sign of moving."
Now, Greely had been given clear instructions before leaving Washington. If a resupply ship failed by the summer of the second year, he was to abandon Fort Conger and make his way south to Cape Sabine, where emergency caches had been left by earlier missions. Orders are orders, but what they asked was staggering. Fort Conger was safe, well, relatively speaking anyway. It was insulated, it was familiar, and it had already gotten the men through 2 Arctic winters. But they couldn't stay. At this point, in 1883, they realized they're down to half rations. Their clothing was all wearing thin, and Greely, a career officer, believed in discipline above instinct. If the order was to go, then they would go. In August 1883, their second year in the Arctic, the men packed what they could into fragile open boats that they had dragged up north in case of an emergency. Now, these weren't icebreakers. They were simply not made for pushing through the sea ice or hauling across frozen ridges. One of the boats, the biggest of them, was only 28 feet, and the rest were like small, kind of rowboats, whaling vessels. But it was all the men had. So they made the hard decision to abandon their shelter, their instruments, and a good deal of equipment in search of rescue in the south. The Journal of Sergeant David Brainerd noted,
"Our departure from Conger was like turning our backs on the last outpost of civilization."
They did not know if the shelter in the cache at Cape Sabine was even intact. They didn't know if rescue was even possible. They had no idea how many passages and shipping lanes were blocked because of the ice. But no matter what they did, the Arctic was closing in, and Fort Conger was no longer an option. In those days, there was no communication, so they had been cut off the world for over 2 years. Anything could have happened in that time. The US could have been attacked and their boat sunk, or it could just be completely ice-related. Maybe someone somewhere forgot to do their administrative duty and kind of forgot about the expedition, leaving them alone and helpless. And this isn't the first expedition that's been lost up there for years at a time where relief ships haven't returned. I talked about the case of Ada Blackjack, which is just another harrowing story of an Inupiat woman who was essentially left behind for years when the company that sent her to set up an outpost on a remote Arctic island off of Alaska essentially just didn't show back up to pick her and the other 3 men up, leaving them to survive on their own for years on Wrangel Island. It was awful. You can click the link if you want to check out that video on the channel, but we're going to move on. Unbelievably though, they're able to actually make the journey and reach Cape Sabine by late October of 1883. So it only took them about 2 months. They were dragging themselves essentially in these battered boats across slabs of ice, slush, and jagged coastal ridges, and it worked. The men were soaked to the bone, frostbitten and starving, but they were still alive. And this was the place, the cache and the lifeline. There should be food here and there should be shelter, that they can wait out their days until a rescue or relief vessel finally shows. And they did find the cache. They found it buried beneath the ice and snow. A few wooden barrels and crates that had been split open by time. Some of the tins had rusted along their seams. There was some food, hardtack, salted meat, and canned vegetables. Tea, but not nearly enough. Certainly not enough for 25 men. Some of the contents were waterlogged, and some of it was spoiled. It was basically enough to last the men a few weeks if rationed brutally, but as you know, in the Arctic winter, you're burning way more calories than you normally would in your day-to-day life. So this certainly was not enough food to go far, and Greely, he knew this. At this location, there was no building, no shelter waiting for them. It was an open, wind-blasted shore. And it's not like on those islands up there, there's any trees or wood for them to collect and kind of make a shelter. It's just hard living. They were able to lash together a makeshift tent from canvas and driftwood, half dug into the snow, and it did help cut down the wind. They sealed off the seam with frozen mud, but it barely held. When the sun vanished in November again, it wouldn't rise for another 4 months. And unfortunately, this is where the cold would drop to temperatures around 40 degrees Celsius or minus 40 Fahrenheit. And yeah, they are the same at those temperatures, by the way, Celsius and Fahrenheit, minus 40, same. But the only essentially survival strategy they had at this point was just to ration their food and kind of slowly burn little pieces of the boats or driftwood that they could just to keep warm. They started to ration their food literally down to the ounce, and then the crumb. They desperately chewed leather from their boots and belts. The boiled seal bones they carried with them from Fort Conger, trying to leach out the last bit of fat. They would set traps for Arctic foxes, and occasionally they actually would catch one and roast it whole. The meat was stringy, tough, and barely edible, but it was warm, and it might just keep them alive another day. They would strip moss from the rocks and boil it into a foul broth. They melted snow for water and added tea leaves for flavor. They actually hoarded some of the candle stubs that they took and tried to get tallow out of them. And when those were gone, they scraped the grease from their lanterns and smeared it across dry hardtack to mimic butter. Now, just to point out, a lot of the heat sources and lamps were actually using forms of fat or whale oil in those times. So it was somewhat edible, though I don't know if I would eat it. But in the early weeks, the men were said to have a sense of camaraderie or pride and how much they were enduring. This was survival, and these guys were tough. This was discipline. This was exactly the kind of thing that could shape strong men. They were suffering, yes, but hey, they were doing it right. These are military guys. They're probably seeing this as some kind of challenge for them. They truly believed for a time that if they could just hold on, someone was coming. With each passing day, the meals got smaller, the fire got colder, and the faces around the tent grew thinner. What began as survival would soon slip into something much, much darker. Before we move on, I just want to drop in and say, if you're enjoying this content, or if you're enjoying the channel, consider subscribing. If you enjoy this video, like it to let us know so we know whether or not to make more of this content. And lastly, the one thing you can do to really help us grow is share this episode or share the channel with someone you know. And that's all I got to say, so we're going to move on. By the new year of 1884, the light had faded and then basically was dark 24/7. But the one thing that was always visible was the weight loss on every man's face. Their cheeks were hollowed, their teeth began to loosen, their voices were weak, and for the worst off of them, they had stopped even shivering. A sign that either they were in advanced hypothermia or had completely lost all physical energy. This is the darkest point. This is where the deaths began. The first to go were the sick and frail. One man simply stopped waking up. Another wandered outside in a daze and never returned. The cold buried their bodies in snow within hours. There was no fuel, no strength, certainly no ceremony. The dead were placed in a snowdrift behind the tent, covered in canvas, and then forgotten, at least for the time. They became part of the landscape, just another shape in the wind. Joseph Ellison, one of the youngest and most cheerful men on the expedition, began to lose his fingers and toes. Frostbite spread up his limbs, blackening and blistering until they detached entirely. His hands fell off at the wrists. His feet would follow. He laid on his back, helpless, dying 1 inch at a time, enduring unimaginable pain in near silence. Unfortunately, he would hang on for months in this crippling, horrific pain until he finally passed from the malnutrition, hypothermia, or a combination of both. But as bad as it got, still, Greely clung to his command. He was still issuing duty rosters, counting what little rations he could, and he tried to maintain discipline. But slowly, the morale was collapsing. Some men began to mutter that others were hiding food, and then it happened. Private Charles Henry was caught stealing from the dwindling supplies. Again, it wasn't his first offense. He'd already been warned. This time, Greely gathered his remaining officers. There was no trial, there was no debate, and Greely gave the order himself. Henry was taken outside and executed by a firing squad. It was a decision that haunted Greely for the rest of his life. From that point on, everything spiraled. The tent became a silent crypt. Men stopped speaking or spoke to people who weren't even there. Some just began sobbing uncontrollably. Others sat for hours staring into the dark. A few began to use the expedition's medical opiates to dull the hunger and hallucinations. It was said that they also were drinking alcohol, tinctures essentially meant for sterilizing wounds, or they were mixing the crushed pain pills with melted snow to consume them. What you could call meals was still just boiled scraps of seal bones and the odd piece of leather where they tried to extract essentially a little bit of nutrients out of, but there was essentially nothing. And as more people began to die, the men didn't even have the energy to bury them outside. It said that even at one point, men were trying to lick the frost off the walls. They were so desperate for anything. And there's another account of someone splitting open a fox carcass and trying to gnaw at the frozen blood inside, just returning to essentially a primal state. But then something changed. Something nobody would like to think about, but it happened. One morning, when they went outside, they found one of the dead men's body partially stripped. It looked as if flesh had been cut off of his legs and his back. Nobody said anything. Nobody wrote it down. But after that, the dead were treated differently. Some were kept closer to the tent. Some were never moved at all. But we do know it does appear that the men did resort to cannibalism of the dead. By the arrival of spring, only a handful of men remained. Most were too weak to stand or malnourished for anything other than basically lying there staring in the dark. A storm had hit in early June, ripping through the tent, tearing at the canvas, and carrying away what little they had left. At this point, another 2 men died in the days that followed. In those final days, Sergeant Brainerd kept writing, but the words barely held together. His once detailed entries became a blur of half-formed sentences, repeated dates, and fragments of numbers and rations tallies. You could really see the psychological toll or breakdown that was happening to this man. It was obvious that his hands were even trembling too much to grip the paper or pencil. The entries, at the end of the day, no longer made sense. Just scratches on paper from a man drifting in and out of consciousness, clinging to the routine in the absence of reason. Somehow, the remaining few had actually held out at Sabine for over 8 months. I'm sure in the back of everyone's mind, the only thought running through the head is just that, can we make it long enough that if rescue is coming, we have a chance. We have a chance to see home again. The hope of rescue was dwindling more day by day. And to make it worse, at this point, the guys had lost track of time, so they don't even know what the date is. And in their darkest moments, something happened. The men were said to have heard the sound of voices carrying over the water. First, they thought it was hallucinations, but slowly they saw a ship, and then the flag. It was actually the rescue. But for most of Greely's crew, it was already too late. And on June 22nd, 1884, Commander Winfield Scott Shelley stepped off the deck of the Thetis and onto the ice-streaked shore of Cape Sabine. The men with him scanned the rocky coastline, expecting at best a few starving survivors. What they found instead was death, silence, and the skeletal remains of what had been a government expedition. 6 men emerged slowly from the remains of the buried tent. They were ghostly thin, their faces hollow and their eyes sunken. Their uniforms hung off them like rags. One of them couldn't speak at all. Another couldn't stand. They had no strength left to call out, no energy to weep. They were alive only in a technical sense. Greely was among them, wrapped in layers of frozen cloth, barely responsive. He tried to stand, then fell to one knee. It took several minutes before the rescuers realized who he was. If you remember the story about Joseph Ellison, the man with frostbite, who passed away after months of agonizing pain and being immobile because his hands and feet essentially fell off? Well, he actually got to see the rescue before he died. And unfortunately, after only a few days on the rescue ship, he actually passed away, somehow making it through the entire winter, only to die once he's finally rescued. Now, the rescue team, they did their best to bury the dead in makeshift graves and pack the survivors in woolen blankets. The tents, bones, journals, and remaining supplies were cataloged and brought aboard. Nothing other than the bodies were really left behind. And as the ship pulled away from the coast, the wind shifted. Behind them, Cape Sabine disappeared to the fog. The Arctic, indifferent as ever, closed in once more around the frozen shore where so many had died. The Greely Expedition was over, but the questions were only beginning. All in all, 6 people in total, including Greely himself, would survive the expedition. And when the Thetis returned with the survivors, the American public didn't know what to think. At first, the 6 survivors were welcomed as heroes, emaciated but alive, having endured what most men could not. But soon, the rumors began. The Navy's recovery team had seen the signs. Too many bodies were missing. Some of the dead had been found partially stripped. And everyone knew the conditions: starvation, frostbite, and endless cold. It didn't take long for whispers of cannibalism to hit the press. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some newspapers ran lurid headlines, while others defended the men as victims of neglect by their own government. Greely gave a formal statement denying that cannibalism had occurred. The other survivors stayed mostly silent, and just like that, the conversation would fade. There was no formal charges, no official admission, and the nation, it seemed, didn't want to know. There were several formal inquiries into the expedition. There was only really a court-martial of one person named General Hazen, who basically was court-martialed for his public comments on the expedition, but ultimately no one was really held responsible for what happened in the Arctic. But the question would linger for over a century, and it wasn't until the 1980s that scientists re-examined the case. Forensic anthropologists studying bones recovered from the island found what the 19th century reports had hinted at: clear evidence of cannibalisms. Human bones bore knife marks, and some had been scraped clean. Several femurs had been cracked lengthwise, consistent with marrow extraction. This was no longer speculation, it seems to be fact. But this story was never just about cannibalism, which I want to point out again, like, this is a common thing, so like people might judge people for doing cannibalism, but back then in the 1800s, there's so many expeditions where people just had to resort to this, and it was kind of codified in maritime law for a long time that like there was even a procedure about drawing lots or straws as to how you would go about selecting who you would eat if everybody was alive or who would be killed. So there's so many stories of this, and you can check out the channel. Like the Franklin expedition, again in the Arctic, is just kind of similar to this story where people end up spending years in a situation without food and end up having to resort to the darkest things imaginable. But I mean, you can focus on the cannibalism, but truly, like, the survival aspect of what these guys went through is almost mind-boggling, because they, on top of their survival, did accomplish a lot. Before the collapse, before the long retreat to Cape Sabine, Greely and his men had spent 2 years conducting scientific research for the first international polar year. They actually, despite the crazy amount of deaths, did successfully record all the data they're supposed to and complete their mission. And that part of the story is overshadowed and forgotten by many. These guys did what they set out to do. And in recent years, authors like Buddy Levy have helped bring the full truth of essentially this expedition back into focus. His book, Labyrinth of Ice, draws from the men's journals, government records, and modern science to tell not just the story of a failed rescue, but of extraordinary endurance in the face of impossible odds. Greely went on to live to an old age. Brainerd, the man writing in the journals, did survive, and he was said to be the last surviving member of the expedition, living up until 1946. But neither man ever publicly admitted what had happened during those final weeks. What happened at Cape Sabine isn't just a tragedy, it was truly a test of leadership, discipline, and the limits of human survival. There's not a lot of stories that I tell about these survival situations where leadership remains intact, and you can truly tell the difference of when a strong leader like Shackleton, for example, is at the helm of these situations. Like, they're able just to keep the group functioning and going. Then you have other stories where leadership isn't as strong, like the story of the Batavia that descends into chaos and mutiny, where every man for himself, or the SS Arctic, for example, when the men are stealing lifeboats and people are killing each other just to like look out for their own rear end, I guess. So, I mean, there's a clear distinction of like great leadership in these situations and not so great leadership, and it makes a big difference. Now, while the dead were buried under the Arctic snow and the journals locked away in military archives, the bones kept speaking, right? This is the evidence of the desperation that these men endured and these guys faced out there on their own in the middle of probably one of the most remote places on Earth. Now, this is certainly not the kind of situation I would ever want to find myself in modern days or in the 1800s. And I couldn't imagine how much these guys went through, but their endurance is the reason I'm here telling you this story today. And it's almost unbelievable to me that 6 people even survived this, considering there's been so many more expeditions where that isn't the case. Now, if you found this story as haunting and as fascinating as I did, consider following or subscribing to the show. And I just want to say thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious and don't eat anyone. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.